Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our session number 2, and despite of somebody playing hookies, we are welcoming two important and interesting communications. One will be delivered by Vytas Jankauskas. He is a well-known medieval historian from Kaunas, from Vilnius, from Vytautas Magnus University, and for the most part, he is interested in the history of the 14th century Lithuania, and especially its relations to Volhynia. And he is, as far as I know, in the final stages of his monograph to be published this year. I hope so. On Liubartas, a very important duke, a son of Algirdas, and I would like Zuckerman by suggesting that when we speak about Theodoritas, and Algirdas, we have to include also, I think, Liubartas, because he was directly affected, and I think that Vytas Jankauskas will prove this point. So it's over to you to begin. Just keep enough close to the microphone.
Dear colleagues, hello. Darius, thank you for warm words. I would like to talk today about Grand Duke of Volhynia Liubartas Gediminaitis, which was baptized by name of Dmitry, and short introduction to his biography, and this is a result of my investigation on Liubartas. So he prepared in Lithuania to be a duke in Ruthenia. He grew in the Duchy of Cracow, where he was born, and approximately 1338 he, after Lithuanian pressures on Mazovia and Halych Volyn, he went to rule Lutsk land and eastern Volhynia. After the death of Yuri II Troidanovich, he conquered the whole Halych Volhynia land, and according to Igor Skochilas, approximately 3041 and 3042, he was initiator of reacting of the Metropolitanate of Halych, and I think we have a late tradition that Liubartas was in Constantinople and brings to the Lutsk the relics of Saint Cross, of Holy Cross, and I think that during 3042 it was possible to visit for Liubartas to Volhynia, but as you mentioned in the my title of the presentation, I am going to talk about a little bit later things about John VI Kantakouzenosʼ action for diplomatical action to the Rus and his letters to Liubartas, and I am going to talk about Liubartas entitling and its context. So, 1347, a letter from Emperor John VI Kantakouzenosʼ to Liubartas revealed several aspects of the problem. First of all, it showed how the Lithuanian state how the Lithuanian state was seen from Constantinople. It is clear that emperor was placing Liubartas in a tradition that had developed over a long period of relation, which unfortunately we cannot trace because we lack of sources between Byzantine and the rulers of Gallic Volhynia. The Byzantine tradition cannot be ignored, but it can only be felt with full perspective. There is no doubt that the Byzantine tradition has splendor and solemnity to that titulature. The question of entitling is involved different traditions, both linguistic and chancery. Equally important is the purpose of the document, whether it is intended to be used locally in international relations or within the state, whether it is an ecclesiastical or a secular document. These distinctions may have been crucial for the identification of the individual, but in a broader context, the distinctions are also important in determining the status of the individual, which was not static, but may have the change over time. As regards the expression of Liubartas' status and his entitlement, it should be noted that we have a clash on a very different tradition. Documents recorded Liubartas' relations with the Byzantine Empire, the Kingdom of Poland, the city of Torun, and the merchants of Lvov. Also ecclesiastical documents. As Liubartas is mentioned in the documents both alone and in groups with other dukes, these aspects also need to be evaluated in order to understand the expression of Liubartas' status through his entitling. The earliest document mentioned of Liubartas that has been dated in letter from the Byzantine Emperor John VI Kantakouzenosʼ concerning to metropolitanate of Gallic. The emperor addressed Liubartas using the traditional Constantinopolitan title of his time, in keeping with the tradition of the Byzantine diplomacy. And this is the first one. Evgenestate Riks Vladimiru ke anepsie tis Vasilias mu kir Dimitria Liubarta. Such an ornate title and address to Liubartas is typical for 14th century Byzantine chancellery. Looking at the overall context, it can be remembered that the process of abolishing the metropolitanate of Gallic was a regional phenomenon involving not only the then ruler of Gallic, Liubartas, but also other princes of Rus. The process was initiated by Grand Duke Simeon of Moscow. The same John VI addressed to the Grand Duke of Moscow the second entitling Evgenestate mega rix pasis Rosia ke peripotite anepsia tis Vasilias mu kir Simeon. The first difference shows the claims and the scopes. While Liubartas is exclusively linked to Vladimir or Volodymyr, Simeon is linked to the whole of Rus. This cannot also be seen as a kind of political manifestation, but it is easy to understand it in the context of the question of the Rus Metropolitanate. Johannes Preiser Kepler proposes that this question be seen through the prism of the ecclesiastical structure in Rus. In order to unite the ecclesiastical structure of the whole of Rus and to overcome the fragmentation of the metropolis, Simeon had to declare his supreme authority in the Rus to Constantinople court. The claims were accepted and recognized at the court of emperor. This allowed Simeon to identify his title with that to metropolitan, who also claimed dominance over the whole of Rus. Liubartas, meanwhile, remained a local player associated only with Vladimir. However, this was a traditional designation of the land of Galич-Volhynia, which required the exclusion of Vladimir as a center. In the general context of this title used by the rulers of Galич-Volhynia at the beginning of the 13th and 14th centuries, already Daniel Romanovich, even before his coronation in Drohichin, was called the Illustrissimus Rex in Western European chronicles. In the 14th centuries, the Romanovich title continued the tradition established under Daniel. His grandson George Yuri I used two titular formulations on his double-sided seal, Sigillum Domini Georgi Regis and Sigillum Domini Georgi Ducis Lodimeria. And his sons Andrei and Leo also used the titular, while Andrei title exclusively emphasized Vladimir Duchy, while at the same time maintaining relations with Rus, Dux Latimeria et Dominus Russia, Dei Gratia Dux Lodimirensis et Dominus Terra Russia. This tradition may have originated in the Daniel's titulatura. The titles of the last Romanovich also the titles of the last Romanovich can also be compared with the form used by Yuri II, which is usually characterized by an undevelopment from form referring. Domains had been Georgis de Gratia Dux Terra Russia, Galicia et Lodomerius, ex dono de natus Dux et Dominus Russia, de Gratia natus Dux Totius Russia, and so on, and so on. We can see certain patterns in the title of the rulers of Galич-Volhynia in the first half of the 14th century. First of all, it can be stated that Volhynia land does not appear in the title. It was completely replaced by the Volodymyr Duchy. A certain hierarchy is also apparent. The rank of the kingdom is associated with Galич, while Vladimir is a duchy dominion. This situation is also reflected in the naming of the land of the Rus kingdom. Galич is usually placed before Vladimir. Despite this situation, it can be noted that Yuri I, eldest son, Andrei, chosen Vladimir as his main domain, although this did not affect the understanding of the hierarchical structure of Galич and Vladimir. Galич continued to be listed in the first position. It is important to note that in titling himself Prince of Vladimir, Andrei also emphasized the Rus components, Dominus Russia, Dominus Terra Russia, and so on, Dominus Totius Terra Russia. Thus, Vladimir represents the whole of Volhynia. The letter of Emperor to Liubartas does not refer to Rus in general. It is part of the titular title. It is the part of entitling of Duke Simeon of Moscow. Although in 3047 Liubartas was still in control of Halich, this element is also absent from this titulatura. Although it is one of the best justified the transfer of the Latin rex to the imperial letter. However, this use of the title raises the question of whether it was taken over from the last Romanovich, who was obliged to maintain relation with Byzantium. If Andrei Yurievich had written letters to Constantinople and had been addressed by the same title as he was in his relation with a Teutonic order, this form of titling would be remained in the imperial chancery. In the correspondence with Liubartas, the element of Rus to which it was transferred to Grand Duke Simeon of Moscow was removed, so that we have a very laconic form of titulatur expression. Another case of Liubartas entitling relates to 3066 treaty between him and King Casimir III of Poland. In it, Liubartas is addressed as Kniaz Veliki Dmitry. This is a very laconic designation, using only the title itself in conjunction with the duke's names, which is written in only one Christian form. Such titling was typical of the leaders of Gediminids in Rus, who used the titles of Grand Duke of Polotsk, Grand Duke of Kiev, and so on. In the internal or ecclesiastical documents, together with Liubartas, they formed a small group of dukes who enjoyed an exclusive status, one of the highest in that dynasty. At the time of At that time, attempts were made to explain this phenomenon in terms of a model of state structure. If Algirdas titles himself emperor, the internal hierarchical principles of the state are not violated if a part of the Gediminids under his command designate themselves as a Grand Dukes. This explanation only partly reflects the essence of the problem. It must be accepted that hierarchical relations within the dynasty were clearly regulated. However, there was another problem. In the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, there was an established system of titles. Lithuanian rulers communicated with the Western European world as a kings, or less often dukes. In communication with the Rus world, they were referred to as Grand Dukes, and in communication with the Byzantine Empire, Algirdas referred to himself as emperor. This fluidity of titles and the attempts to adapt to the circumstances and the context of the country with which one is communicating shows that in Lithuania at that time the title of ruler was used in the local language. Jurginis would probably be right when he says that it was the word viešpats. And it was only in the case of international relations that it was necessary to switch to another system. In the land of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, Rus, the situation was different. In this case, we have Liubartas' relation with Casimir III, where he used the title of Grand Duke, so he is acting as a local actor in his relationship with a foreign ruler. It should be noted that this is not the first time of Liubartas used the title of Grand Duke in his relationship with Poland. The title of Grand Duke was also used in the letter of guarantee to Jan Bidinovich to come to Volhynia, Magni Ducis Demetri. However, this is a summary of the text translated from Ruthenian into Latin and placed in the document register. However, from the overall context, it seems that Liubartas' holdings were not specified in this case either. Thus, there is a certain systematic nature of the titling of Liubartas' communication with King Kazimierz III of Poland. Liubartas was referred to as a Grand Duke, but not specified, but no specific holdings were specified. This may have been due to the fact that the relationship between the Polish king and Liubartas was about the extent of the domains in Volhynia, who was to rule what. If should be noted that Liubartas' titling as Grand Duke may also have originated from a tradition in Polish-Romanovich relations. Another example of Liubartas' titling comes from his privilege to the citizens of Lvov, who were granted trading rights in 1379. Wir großer Fürster Demeter von den Gnaden Gottes von Vladimir and von Lutsk. This is the most elaborate example of Liubartas' titling when he is not only titled Grand Duke but also defined his domains, Vladimir and Lutsk. The element of power by the grace of God is also emphasized. This is the relationship between the unequal partners of that time, where Prince Liubartas clearly felt his superiority over the citizens of Lvov. This relation between the communicating parties is a clear indication of how Liubartas saw himself, a ruler by God's grace, a sovereign with hereditary power. In the act of Liubartas, this is not apparition, although if there were agreement on successors between Algirdas and Kęstutis, perhaps at the end of the reign the same agreement was made on Liubartas' successors. The practice of naming Liubartas simply as Grand Duke was also common in the case of ecclesiastical documents. In the Lutsk Psalter, written in 3084, which was commissioned by his son, Liubartas is also named simply as Grand Duke, Knязя Великого Дмитрия Gediminovича. At this point, a remark should be made referring back to the forgery of the inscription of the St. John's Church in Lutsk in 3022. In the context of the debate and in support of the idea that the Liubartas document may have been partially forged, it is necessary to draw attention to Liubartas title. Я, Liubartas Gediminovich, Lutsky, Vladimirsky kniaz. It is atypical in that it covers a territory but does not name Liubartas as Grand Duke. There are numerous examples of other Gediminids being named Grand Dukes in ecclesiastical documents. Vladimiras Algirdaitis, Kaributas Algirdaitis, Andrius Algirdaitis. This is a very clear trend in Lithuanian political culture in the 14th century. And although we do not have a single fully preserved document of Liubartas for the church, we can rely on Švitrigaila's confirmation of the donation of the Dormition of the Mother of God in Volodymyr, which was made by Liubartas. Although the deed is not transcribed exactly, but rather incorporated into Švitrigaila's document by retelling it, it preserves a fairly authentic title, Veliki Kniaz Liubart Gediminovich. At the time of the confirmation, it's likely that Liubartas' name was changed from a Christian to a pagan one, as the use of a pagan name was not usually characteristic of tradition of Gediminids church documents. In addition to this, we can distinguish other documents that were not composed by Liubartas alone, but in collaboration with other Gediminids. The earliest such document is a letter of guarantee from Kęstutis and Liubartas to the merchants of Torun, who are allowed to travel to Volhynia by a certain route through Kęstutis' land. The dukes are simply referred to by their first names, od kniazia, od Kęstuta, od kniazia, od Liubarta, only leaving only the note that the document was issued by dukes as a part of the title. A very laconic title is written in the text of the 1352 agreement with Poland. Ja kniaz Jaunutį į Kęstutį į Liubart Yuri Narimantovich Yuri Karyatovich, where the title of dukes appears only before the name of Jaunutis. In the 1366 treaty between Kazimir and the Lithuanian princes, the list of princes was based on a very similar principle, expected that in the case the first Grand Duke Algirdas was listed, then the other members of the dynasty were listed, indicating not their title but their relationship to blood relationship to the ruler, and that they were brothers. Князь Великий Ольгерд со своим братьем, с Кęstutiem, с Явнутием, с Liubartom и со своими детьми. We can also mention the title of Liubartas in the Pope Gregory XI's letter of 1373 to the Lithuanian dukes, Nobilibus viris Oligerdo, Magno et Kęstuto ac Liubarto fratribus ducibus Lituanorum. The Pope addressed the three Lithuanian dukes with the title nobleman, and the title approached at the end of defining the entire group of dukes as Lithuanian dukes, which means very high status in the dynasty structure of the dynasty of Grand Duchy of Lithuania. Obviously, the title of Liubartas reflected the high status of his duke, which did not differ from the highest position in the dynasty. One can compare the titles of Liubartas and Kęstutis, which were identical in group documents. This indicates that Liubartas was one of the most important members of the dynasty. This exceptional status in Rus was expressed both through his tutelary entitling and other symbolic elements. In Constantinople, Liubartas was seen as the heir of the rulers of Halych Volhynia, but dominance in Rus was transferred to Moscow. However, looking at Liubartas' situation in the context of Lithuania, it is necessary to note that he was allowed to express the attributes of sovereignty in his entitling. Thank you very much for your attention.
Okay, thank you so much for your presentation, and I think it will be okay if we have questions asked for two speakers at the end of this session. So I would like to introduce Yanina Ryier, who is a Belarusian scholar, and she belongs to the younger generation of Belarusian scholars who are eager to connect Belarusian scholarship to the wider European scholarship, and nowadays she pursues her academic career in Poland at the Ignatianum University in Cracow, and she has done some very useful work on the study of the image of Lithuanians, on their relations with the Teutonic Order, and so it's this fascinating time, her presentation devoted to the same topic of entitling of Lithuania. That is a rather difficult topic to tackle. So, okay, it's done already. Thank you.
Okay, thank you a lot. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers and, of course, Professor Baronas for their kind invitation and for this opportunity to present some results of my studies on the power and the role and functions of the ruler in the early Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And, of course, I would like to greet all of you that you are here and probably will have some questions or valuable pieces of advice. So. To start with, in this paper, I would like to present the reflection of the Byzantine tradition in the titles of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania, in the narratives and diplomatic documents from the 14th and 15th century. And the choice of this topic can be explained by the fact that while studying the mechanisms of power legitimization in the early Grand Duchy of Lithuania, I drew my attention to the role of titles or the process of entitling, which has a really huge role in the process of institutionalization a ruler as a legitimate ruler, not only inside the state but also outside by the neighbors. In this respect, we can appeal to the role of a title in studies of on a ruler power, and to consider a ruler's title as the evidence, in fact, of his identification by his subjects or by the representatives of other states, and of course his self-identification as a tool for strengthening his legitimacy within society or within the state. And in fact, its representation in narrative sources and diplomatic documents can be considered as a marker of first a ruler's actual position in a particular society or on the international political scene, which is quite tricky because within Lithuanian phenomena it didn't actually work, and it didn't necessarily mark it, but of course it should be taken into account. And it also can serve as a marker of the reflection of the ideological foundations of his power and authority, which means that the biases to which a ruler applies in his entitling or self-entitling, as well as the methods or implications that are used by the neighbors or by neighboring estate or chronicles, also have these ideological implications. And of course, it can be a marker of certain political goals that are going to be achieved by use of this or that titles in the correspondence or in narratives. And of course, here we also should take into account that the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was developing in extremely difficult and even confusing circumstances. And of course, I won't repeat everything that was brilliantly covered by various scholars on the Grand Duchy of Lithuania. And when it comes to this Byzantine context, it was perfectly presented today by Professor Shepard and by Professor Zuckerman. So I will just refer to some items in the context of explanation, but I won't do the same thing, of course. But the thing that we should keep in mind that, in fact, several traditions influenced the development of the political institutions in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and it was a mixture of Baltic, Latin, and Byzantine traditions that were implicated in not only political structure itself, but also in the process of power institutionalization and entitling as one of the components. As we are here to discuss the Byzantine presence in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, of course, I would like to emphasize the moment or the Byzantine context in the development of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, because obviously that the population of the annexed territories or principalities of Rus, they were mostly Orthodox and with long-term tradition of not only Christianity, but also of the perception of power based first on Byzantine political and cultural tradition. That's why we should keep into mind, or we should keep in mind, a complex circumstance or complex surrounding in which the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was developing, as well as constant maneuvering between Eastern and Western neighbors, between Latin and Orthodox world, between Christianity and paganism, as well as necessity to strengthen authority by the Grand Dukes of Lithuania, both within the state, to overcome the possible opposition in the principalities of Rus, to annexed, to get popularity in the annexed lands, and of course to overcome opposition and even separatism by some representatives of Baltic nobility. So keeping everything in mind, we can move on, and it was just a short introduction, but of course we could discuss it for hours. The titles used in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and this is another complicity that should be taken into account while conducting such kind of research, they were not static. And in fact, they were obviously transformed during the process of state formation and evolution, and they could reflect the growing political authority of a leader or the strengthening unity of the territories and their administration. But again, however, they were often influenced by the specific ideological and political implications of their producers. I'm not the first one here to analyze the titles of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania, and this is just the short list to start with, and the list is much more extensive. And it was probably Jan Adamus in the 1930s who was one of the first to pay his attention to the process of entitling of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania and to trace this development and even dualism or complexity or transitivity of titles used in different traditions. And of course, there were attempts to analyze titles in different contexts by other researchers, including Stephen Rowell and Jakub Ragulski, and so on and so forth. And if we discuss this Byzantine component, so of course it was John Meyendorff, who referred to Byzantium influence on including the titling, the rulers of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania and Marcinius Rochka and Giedrė Mickūnaitė, who referred to the image of an ideal ruler Vytautas in Pochvala Vytautu, and Kristina Sverevičiūtė, who analyzed the Algirdas letter to Patriarch of Constantinople, and in fact it was her explanation of the terms used and provided today, and of course Darius Baronas, who analyzed the letters of Algirdas and Gediminas in their ideological context, but again we shouldn't be limited to this exactly because it can be much more extended. Anyway, if we refer to the title or to this Byzantine presence in the titles of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania, the most common example provided is mentioned by Dr. Mitzger today, letter from the Lithuanian Grand Duke Algirdas to Patriarch Philotheos from 1371, and in fact this title of Basileus mentioned there and translated in the 19th century Russian translation as Tsar and in Catherine's translation as a king, is not only a demonstration of this relevance to Byzantine tradition and its employment for some political purposes, of course, but it's also a vivid demonstration of this transparency of the titles within different traditions, and of course the complexity of their translation and finding a relevant translation in some case. Anyway, it's not only the term of Vasilevs mentioned here, but there is another reference to Algirdas found in this letter, and in fact I would apologize in advance for any irrelevancies in translations or explanations because my Greek is still poor and I'm just on my way to improve it. So when we analyze this letter and when we take into account on all the existing studies and we take it for granted that obviously there was a Byzantine presence in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and it should have influenced somehow on the process of state formation and power legitimization and also on the use of titles in some way, the following research questions can be asked. So, in fact, I was curious about it. So we can ask ourselves if Byzantine tradition was dominant in the titles of the rulers of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and if it was typical of the rule of Algirdas and Vytautas only, as I have already mentioned, Algirdas' letter and the reference to Vytautas as Caesar or the ruler of the rulers in Pochvala Vytautu, or it can be found in the early period, and what is the role of the employment of Byzantine tradition in the titles of the Grand Dukes of Lithuania from the mid-13th to the death of Vytautas. And while attempting at answering the questions, probably it should be also taken into account that we cannot take everything for granted. I mean, we should categorize the title that are met in the sources in some way. And here I would divide them into three main categories. So first of all, we should take the title employed by the monarch himself in the documents of his office as the reflection of his self-identification and probably even pretensions or some political goals to be achieved. Then we should differentiate the title used in international correspondence related to the ruler as the testimony of his international recognition and authority, which can be found in incoming documents and third-party ones, and these should be distinguished as well because it matters. And the title used in narrative sources expressing not only societal attitude toward him or his real position in the society, but also reflecting the social political conditions in which these narratives were created. So, and here I would show just, or I would attempt at just a brief demonstration of various titles used to name the rulers of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and I will try to show the most vivid examples, although, of course, the list of these examples is much more extensive, broad, and these are just some of them. In fact, I would share Jan Adamus and other researchers' point of view that, of course, from the very beginning of the existence of the state, the titles were not stable, they were flexible, and they were dependent a lot on the office in which they were created or to which they were addressing. So, for instance, in both incoming outgoing correspondence to Mindaugas, he is addressed as a ruler, but then after his coronation as a rex or as a king, and if it comes to the Latin office, so we have typical for Latin office script methods of entitling, illustre rega Litovia, and then Mindove de gratia lex Litovia, and so on and so forth. In fact, it's quite interesting that although Mindaugas was the only factual crowned king of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, the same titles were employed to other rulers of the state later on, but in some specific circumstances. So when it comes to, of course, we do not have so much material when it comes to the epoch of Mindaugas, but still, if it comes to narrative titles that can be found, so again, they vary depending on the narrative tradition they were created in, and if in German tradition he is named as Hostikönig or König, and after his coronation, especially in Latin sources, he is called or entitled as Rex. In Russian or Ruthenian and Lithuanian tradition, he is mostly called or named as Knyaz, Knyaz Veliki, or Duke, the Grand Duke, Gospodidich. That is found in Galician Volhynian Chronicle. But what is important that another title is found in Galician Volhynian Chronicle, and it sounds as Samoderzhets, which can be originated or dated back to the Greek autokratos, so the sower power, which obviously has these Byzantine roots. And from my point of view, it wasn't occasionally done because obviously, as it has already been mentioned today, Galician and Volhynian Principality had strong connections or stable connections with Byzantine or with Constantinople, and they were aware of the meaning of this title and of the role that it had. Anyway, it wasn't the title that was dominant in relation to Mindaugas, and in various sources he can be called as König, illustre rega, Rex, de gratia Rex, Veliki Knyaz Litovski, or the Grand Duke, Samoderzhets, Gospodar, and so on and so forth, which may lead us to a kind of assumption that during that first stage, let's say, of the formation of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, there was the absence of a clear term denoting a place and status of a ruler of Lithuania, and according to the main tendency in historiography, it wasn't until Algirdas and mostly until Vytautas' reign, and it changed depending on the annalistic tradition that created a narrative and named the rule according to the norms that existed in particular social cultural communities, so Rex in Latin and Duke and the Grand Duke in Lithuanian and Russian, and the documents that came out of the office of a Lithuanian ruler were also based on the traditions of the addressee and were subordinated to the same rule. And at the same time, the status that occurs both in documents of the ruler's era and in later narratives indicates a high level of his self-identification as a ruler, as well as recognition of him as such by neighboring estates. In fact, the same can be applied to the reign of Gediminas, who is quite ambiguous in his outgoing correspondence, and he is also named King of the Lithuanians and Ruthenians in his Latin correspondence, and he is called Rex, Princeps, and Dukes, in the latter from 1323, where he addressed to all Christians and especially to the citizens of some particular cities and promising to be baptized and to convert Lithuania. And the German tradition is, for instance, used almost at the same time, during his reign, but in his addressing another office. The same strategy or the same tendency can be found in incoming correspondence as well, he can be called a duke, he can be called king, but mostly a rex, of course, or a ruler, because here we are faced with the difference between his higher self-identification, especially in his letters to the Pope, and aiming and perceiving himself or displaying himself as a legal ruler and as a powerful ruler, and the reverse letters by his often opponents. Anyway, his high status as the highest ruler in the state is recognized even by the representatives of Christian world. But again, we won't go into detail, but in case with Pope, who was recognizing him, of course, it obviously done because of the hope of Lithuania to be baptized and because of some certain political goals to be potentially achieved. When it comes to narrative titles of Gediminas, so he is called as a knyaz or Veliki Knyaz or Duke, the Grand Duke in Russian tradition, and he is called Rex in Latin mostly, or Gediminas, just Gediminas or Pagan Gediminas, and he is called Veliki Knyaz in Lithuanian tradition as well. So again, we have this transference from Russian and Lithuanian reality to the same position that is found in Latin or German word. And here, of course, sometimes I differentiate between German and Latin tradition, and sometimes I put them together, and I put them together when there are German sources written in Latin, so that to show the terms used. Anyway, we do not see so much of Byzantine presence in the titling until Algirdas' reign and until the letter mentioned. And here we can ask ourselves a question: so what did change during Algirdas' reign, and did anything change at all, right? So why this Byzantine presence appeared? And here again we can come back to the mentioned above letter to Patriarch Philotheos, and obviously the high status that is used by Algirdas was quite simply explained by his need for presenting himself as a legitimate, as a ruler of a high status, to be on the level, because in fact he was answering back to Patriarch, and in his attempt to be rulers of other principalities, and in his attempts to be responsible for the actions that are happening in the lands, and so on and so forth. Anyway, it was, again, we come back to this differentiation between different types of titles, and we should take into account that it was his self-title. It was title that he used to identify himself, and here we can appeal to it, or can refer to it as in fact a narrative construct used to emphasize his legitimacy. But when we analyze other documents which in fact mention Alguiders, or which mention Lithuanians that were issued in the Constantinople offers, we can find other titles or other terms used. Though a title of a strong authority or sovereign ruler can be found in the decree from 1361, and then a chief or a ruler in the lands can be found in the decree from 1364, as well as analog to Rex. I hope that this translation or this transfer is correct enough. That can be translated, in fact, the Grand Duke in Russian, and that was, in fact, broadly used in reference to other princes of Rus can be found. And probably this is the most often used and employed title in the correspondence from that period. And I would also emphasize the letter from 1370 from Patriarch's excommunication decree to the princes of Rus, who refused to participate in the war against the Lithuanian Grand Duke, where he is emotionally called or named blasphemous, wicked Alguiders. And again, we are faced with this necessity to find some proper, quite emotional word to describe a thing, excluding him from any royal titles. That's why, of course, there's just few examples, but they illustrate the irrelevance between the attempts to legitimate themselves as the rulers and the attempts that were factually used by other offices. And when it comes to third-party documents issued in other offices, there is still a dualism of prevailing ranks in Latin offices and Veliki Knyaz or the Grand Duke in Russian spelling or Old Russian, which is found in the charters or in the letters that were issued in Latin and Grand Ducal offices respectively. When it comes to his entitling or his way of self-identification, again, it depended on the addressee, and if he called himself a Basilevs, which had already explained, he also used various terms, including the Grand Duke, Algert, in Russian transcript. And here we still have this irrelevance in the use or in the employment of various titles that were employed to refer to the same ruler. And in fact, the same can be found in narrative titles used, and we still have Knyaz Litovsky Olgert, or the Grand Duke of Lithuania, or Duke Olgert, or Olgert without any titles, depending on a chronicle. And the same situation is in the Lithuanian tradition, so he is mostly called as Grand Duke or Duke, Knyaz Litovsky and Knyaz Veliki Litovsky, and he still ranks mostly in German and Latin tradition. Anyway, something is changing during Vytautas' reign, because his title, and it's not, of course, my claim, it has been done before, has been stabled by this time, and this title has been fixed somehow, to some extent, in both narrative and documentary tradition, and that is why we can find relevant titles used to describe his status as a Grand Duke. So we can find Magnus Princeps, Supremos Dukes, although it doesn't always work with German tradition, because they mostly call him as a Herzog, which in fact can be also explained by a kind of calque that has been somehow transferred, although it depends a lot on the exact time that the document was issued. When it comes to outgoing correspondence and documents, again, we remember the historical background of Vytautas becoming the Grand Duke of Lithuania and his path to power and to this status. That is why this status is, of course, different, and it firms probably by the very end of the 14th century and mostly to the late 15th, when he becomes Grand Dukes in almost all the traditions found, Dux Supremus, Magnus Dux, Dux Magnus, Grossfürster, Grossfürsten, and so on and so forth, can be found in all traditions or in all the documents under analysis and in all the examples found. And it's okay. And it's interesting that this transparency in different traditions is observed in Lithuanian tradition also, and Vytautas is called predominantly as a Grand Duke in all his documents. So we can see, for instance, Charter of the Grand Duke to the boyars of Polotsk on the procedure for collecting extraordinary taxes from them. And и посмотрели мы в листе даде нашего великого князя Витовта is just an example. Also there are plenty. Великий князь Литовский, Русский, Жемойцкий, князь Великий. And what is important here is that not only the title, but rather relevance to the state or to a ruler as a representative or the highest representative of the state can be observed. And not purely Byzantine, of course, because here I refer to this term of Moya Держава, but still I would assume that it has its roots in Byzantine perception of a possession of a ruler and a highest supreme ruler that possesses all his lands and his subjects to show and to emphasize this superiority. And again, the same can be observed in narrative titles appealed to Vytautas. He is mostly named as a Grossfürsten, Grossenfürsten, Großherzog in German tradition, although sometimes, of course, again, depending on the time he's retrieved from this title. But what is interesting, he is probably the first ruler of Lithuania to whom Polish tradition, namely Jan Długosz, gives this highest position of a ruler, similar to Caesar or Alexander Macedonsky in his annals when he discussed the position or the choice of Jogaila as a ruler, and he compared him to Vytautas, who from his point of view was really glorious and ambiguous and talented ruler who could be compared to Alexander Macedonsky. And the same can be found, in fact, in a tractatus, let's say, or a note by Franciscus de Comitibus, who dissuades Vytautas from seeking the crown in 1429, who also compares him to Alexander the Great, and he also emphasizes his high status and potential as a ruler over the land, and he refers to him as a Caesar, which is obviously of Byzantium origins. Anyway, we cannot refer to it as a pure documentary source because it has all the traits of epistolary. And here we transfer to the last point of our discussion because, in fact, probably this depiction of Vytautas as the great Duke of Lithuania, who is similar to Alexander the Great and who is similar to Caesar, who possesses all the lands that are in his power and authority and who is standing over his subjects, was exaggerated in the source from Lithuanian tradition, namely in Pochvala Vytauto, who is also called as a Tsar or Basileus, and who is also called Gospodar, which was important in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, and this is another quite specific term that emphasizes the connection between subjects and their, let's say, master, who is responsible for their well-being. Of course, this position is exaggerated here. I would also emphasize another fragment. Of course, Pochvala Vytauto is well known, so I won't stop here for a while. And this is only to show that we transfer from real titles used in correspondence and diplomacy, and we go to the narrative titles that were used to due to certain political aims, in this case to proclaim Vytautas as a noble ruler, as the greatest Duke of Lithuania, but in some key or some way his attempt to be this, but from the point of view of chronicler, can be found in the Suprasul Chronicle, who implies the potential Vytautas words into the narrative and tells that let's go to their Tatar land and capture it and obtain the царство, and we will apply, or посадим царя Токтамыша, и он мя посадить на всю русскую землю. So he will or I will become basileus of all Russian lands. Here we could make an assumption, not going too deep due to the lack of time, of course, but we can refer to this Byzantine presence in entitling or referring to a ruler in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania as not a title but rather a discourse tragedy that was used to emphasize this Byzantine presence and traditions that obviously existed, but at the same time to achieve other goals. And here we first refer to the connection or to the emphasis on the connection between a ruler and a church. And in fact, the first such example can be found in the Jakob's or Bishop of Polotsk, Jakob's letter to where he calls Vytenius as his son, emphasizing this connection between Orthodox Church and a Lithuanian ruler, although a pagan one, of course. Then we can emphasize the importance of a ruler as a head of the church, Велика суть покорение нашей церкви, and of course the reference to a ruler as государь, so the higher, the supreme ruler, again who is quite connected to his subjects. And what is also important is the emphasis on the ruler's power that is blessed by God. And here we have this Christian dogma of the only ruler in the sky and the only ruler on the desk, and although it hath both Latin and Byzantine, of course, application, this is something that is obviously goes from the old Russian tradition, and again reference to the state as something supreme. So to conclude this short introduction, and probably controversial, let's see. So we can say that the titles used for self-identification and identification of rulers underwent a certain evolution reflecting strengthening state structure and the growing role of central authority, although it wasn't developing on the same pace. The development of statehood in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania was influenced by exogenous factors leading to language borrowings to denote the ruler high potential or political rank and legitimize rulership, and this can be seen in the pluralism of how Lithuanian rulers were addressed in various courts and perceived in different narrative traditions, particularly in Western and Eastern, as well as, and it also works to the titles issued in their own office. And the Byzantine tradition of naming the ruler and describing their power was connected with their conversion, or at least their potential conversion, or at least their contacts with this or that church and possible integration into the Christian world, and that's why probably closer to the conversion of Vytautas, their growest or their stronger emphasis is on his representation as a higher figure. And although the Byzantine tradition of titling the Grand Dukes of Lithuania didn't have a dominant or vivid representation in their official titling, it was familiar to the members of the ruling family and was employed to achieve certain political goals, as in case with patriarch Philophairs, or as it was done in narrative devoted to Vytautas, or as it was done in the letter of Gediminas to the Pope, where he is called blessed by God ruler, although he hadn't been crowned. However, it's primarily observed in discourse tragedies employed by documents creators and chronicles to achieve their political and ideological aims. And these tragedies include descriptive characteristics and comparisons, those with Caesar, but without direct entitling, or comparison with Alexander the Great as an example, rather than direct titles reflecting the real political situation in the state. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you for your very wide and very detailed coverage of the tricky and thorny topic of the titling of the Lithuanian rulers. I am more skeptical about their commitment and about their seriousness of taking their own titles very seriously, because as you could see, the titles vary to a great degree, reflecting the traditions of different chanceries, but we will be able to discuss this topic a bit more during the session of questions. And if you may, Vytas, come on the stage, and now we have an ample opportunity to ask our wonderful speakers questions that could be that arose in your minds, and speak out, please.
Thank you. My question to Vytas Jankauskas. So this prince got name Liubart at his birth, and baptismal name of Dmitri, and all those sources you shows to us. In most cases, he is named as Dmitri, and in some cases as Liubart. So do you have any idea? So why this choice was made every time? One, in some cases, he's named in these sources as Dmitry, while in other cases as Liubart. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your question. I was trying to think about this. I was thinking, and I don't have a clear answer to this question. In some cases, there are double name. That is a perfect situation when we have Liubartas Dmitry, and we can understand that we are talking about that concrete person. In other cases, sometimes selected. Sometimes is selected. Was selected Lithuanian name. Sometimes was selected baptism name, and I do not have answer. The most strange for me was that in the ecclesiastical document was the Liubart used Liubartas Gediminovich form. Maybe it is possible to know because this special person, because after some time this document was issued approximately 40 years after Liubartas' death, and after some time the baptism name was forgotten. For example, in 16th century documents, we have only form of the name, only Liubart. So maybe this name was especially in the society and was good known. Thank you.
Thank you both for the wonderful papers. I have a question for each one of you. Let me start with Vytas. The same text that you have presented, it's about Ευγενέστατε Ρix Volodimiru and Anipsietis Vasilias μου Kyr Dimitrie Liubartas. First of all, I'm impressed about the Greek form of the name, Liubartas. It's not like we hear Liubartas, which is, I mean, I don't know if it has something to do with phonetics or how people would pronunciate the name or how the Greeks could perceive probably the name when it was read. And in relation to the Simeon, which followed your example, there is the difference between the two of them. The first is Rix, and the second one is Megas Rix. Mm-hmm. And you have also the addition of Peripothitos. And this makes also a difference in the second example of Simeon. This makes this is a higher degree. Yes, so yes. He puts them in a kind of order or hierarchy. I think this is really interesting in your example.
Yes. And it's definitely, thank you for your question, it definitely shows different status, different attitude of the Byzantine court, Byzantine chancellery to the Liubartas and to the Grand Duke of Simeon. The other structure of the titulature and the migration, the part of the rules shows that when the Liubartas was losing Metropolitanate of Galicia, he was losing Andrews, and his formal position in Rus. I think so.
Thank you. I just also have in mind this model that Franz Dölger has constructed about the Familie der Herrscher, the families of the rulers, and how the Byzantines were positioning each ruler differently in their, even to the correspondence, not only in the late Byzantine period, but also in the previous centuries. And Yanina, thank you so much for your wonderful presentation about the Pitakion that you mentioned. I'm sorry, I'm coming back to that. It's interesting that at the beginning, what you read, Pitakion to Rigos, this was not a part of the letter. It was written by somebody in the Patriarchate. So it is how they describe the contents of the document. So they give Rigos. They don't write Vasilevs. You find these Vasilevs in the self-naming of the ruler. Ego Algerdos, Vasilevs Litvon. And it's, this is also interesting, that they give the text of the foreign ruler as it arrived. They didn't change the titulation of...
Thank you a lot for your note and for your remark. And in fact, this is something I highlighted, but I just skipped, because the thing was that I was attempting to emphasize is this real difference between his self-identification as a Basilevs and a ruler that was scribed there by official office, which has vivid, or which presents this difference between self-perception or self-attempting at pretending and a real position demonstrated by the office. Yeah, thank you a lot. It was really crucial, and I just somehow skipped it. Mm-hmm.
I would like to add one thing, so to say, for the general audience, especially to those of our colleagues who do not deal directly with Lithuania-related sources. One of the most curious and intractable problems is that we do not know for sure how Lithuanian rulers called themselves in vernacular. So this is a problem, that tertium non datur, and I also suspect that, for example, our agents from abroad who were corresponding with them, they also didn't know quite exactly how to address them. In any case, there were some doubts as to address them correctly, and as you could see, the rulers of Lithuania, so to say, they could use a variety of titles, and it is a kaleidoscopic panorama that was presented by our speakers. And so, Sebastian, go ahead with your question, please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, both of you, for having given us this panorama of titles and all the difficulties inside. And just a few suggestions to your presentation, Yanina. The first point is that you showed very, very clearly that Rex is a title of importance in the 14th century. It is perhaps the usual title, and I would even say that the Basilevs in the writing to Byzantium can be understood as just misunderstanding Basilevs as Old Greek Rex. Okay, that's another point. But there is this change you mentioned under Vytautas, and I'm sure that you're right, that there is a fundamental change. Would you also agree that that could be related to his relationship to Jagiełło Jogaila as supreme ruler, because Vytautas is not in the same way a sovereign ruler of Lithuania as his predecessors perhaps were. And two short remarks again. Alexander, this comparison to Alexander the Great, yes, due to his name, because he had been baptized in the name Alexander, perhaps. And the other point, the Tsarstvo, which is also a very, very interesting issue, but doesn't it derive from the Mongols? Is it the meaning that the Mongol rulers were always addressed as Kaiser or Tsar in the sources, indeed have this over-rulership over total Russia? Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you a lot for your comments and for your questions. When it comes to Vytautas, I will try to answer according to the order of the comments and the questions. So when it comes to his official titles reflected or reflecting his actual position in a state, so here we should take into account the period. And obviously, after all this confusion that was in their struggle with Jogaila, it was reflected, and if under or before the period of state in the border, in the relations, there could be self-estimate attempts to exaggerate his own position, right? So while going through this conquer, but while the process has been stabled, of course he should have recognized the actual state of affairs. In fact, a very interesting reference can be found is, but not in documentary sources, but in narrative tradition, namely in the chronicle by Eberhard Windecker, who describes the relationship between Vytautas and Jogaila, and although he recognized Jogaila as a supreme leader, let's say, but he is quite skeptical of his and his policy, and on the other hand, he highlights the prominence of Vytautas, and this is another issue, of course. But of course, it found its reflection, and in fact, the title, the thing I wanted to emphasize, that it was directly connected to certain political processes that were going or were in the state. Yeah, so, but here there are specialists in the field, so I like take it for granted that you are aware. When it comes to his comparison to Alexander the Great, yeah, so it's a good point, and thank you a lot. And in fact, it has been discussed in historiography that obviously there is a parallel between Alexander, a name, and Alexander the Great, so the comparison of names, although there is analogy to Alexander the Great as a supreme ruler of the great territories and a talented military leader. So here we have multi-layered comparison or analogy, I would say. And when it comes to the last question about царство, I'm sorry for my pronunciation in Russian. Here, of course, we do not discuss the origins of the word itself, but we rather describe the concept of understanding царство, something similar to those possessed by the basileus in Byzantium. So they are, let's say, relevant. I hope that I'm not mistaken and I'm telling the truth. Yeah, so here there is more about comparing the concept rather than speaking about the roots of the word origin. Yeah.
I think that Sebastian's reference to the Golden Horde is very important, so to say, and it is always so that we have to keep in mind the Mongol horde because it was the source of legitimacy, and so to say, the recognition of sovereignty over Rus lands was an issue, so to say, to be reckoned with for every ruler pretending to be active on the present-day Ukraine's lands. And also I think that it would be good to analyze those Lithuanian titles in the context of how that rulers of the Balkan countries were addressed in Greek sources. Also, it would shed, I think, some insights and to provide a more general context to this fascinating topic. Are there any more questions, please? Yes, go ahead, please.
I have a short question to Yanina. I thank you for your wonderful presentation, but as far as I recall, you haven't mentioned the rival Lithuanian princes and their titles like Kęstutis or Svitrigaila. I'm curious if you have also analyzed their titles, and the question would be interesting to pose how their titles influenced the titles of their rivals, which were the ruling Lithuanian princes. Thank you.
Okay, thank you a lot for your question and remark. As I have already mentioned, due to the lack of time, I focused on the most prominent examples because it's impossible to talk about everything. But there were two important aspects that were taken into account while selecting the examples and the rulers. When it comes to Svidrigaila, this is another period, and I was focusing on the so-called pagan rulers or recently converted rulers, because Vytautas was in fact the first fully converted and died as Christian. I'm sorry.
He was baptized 3 times.
Yeah, 3 times, but successfully. And so in contrast to Algirdas, who was baptized, let's say, but died as a pagan, he died as a Christian, okay? So I was attempting and tracing this power development of pagan rulers of Lithuania and successfully, baptized. But when it comes to Svidrigaila's issue, this is another period and there is completely another state of affairs. When it comes to Kęstutis, there is also a significant difference because here we come to diaconal authority, or we have let's say, a different, again, state of affairs, but namely or specifically in the system of governing or in system of administration. Yeah, so of course I'm aware of this fact, and probably in publication of potential it could be or should be, illustrated, but for the purpose of the current study, I considered it reasonable to get rid for the purity of experiment.
Yes.
Sorry,
Go ahead, please.
may I have a very short idea that came up to my mind after hearing about Alexander the Great? I remember that also Alexios III, the ruler of Trapezunt, was very interested. I mean, we are still in the 14th century. He was interested in Alexander the Great, and he even commissioned this illustrious manuscript with wonderful illuminations about the Alexander Roman of Alexander. Perhaps it could be interesting for you just to see it also in the context of the broader area, Black Sea and Lithuania. Thank you.
Thank you a lot.
Yes, please. Self-service.
Well, mine, thank you very much. Mine is a very short question because I think it's unanswerable. But I would just like to ask it because I think one of our speakers said that titles, the use of titles, was important not only to them personally, but to their entourages, to their courtiers, to their nobles, indeed to their rivals. And my question is, well, how would one know, or rather, how would the entourage, how would the nobles, the rivals, know the manner in which these rulers, Gediminas or whatever, were addressed by the Byzantine emperor or a German ruler and so on. In other words, the question is, do we have any evidence, and I think this is a num question, but do we have any evidence, do either of you know, of the circumstances in which letters were received at the court of any of our Lithuanian rulers from the 13th century onwards? In other words, do we have any indication at all of how whether they were read out aloud and thus were known, were communicated to the entourages, the nobles, the courtiers, and so on? I fear it's a numb question, maybe a dumb question, but I've just thought I'd plant it for you.
I will answer just in 2 words, of course. I mentioned the opposition of the nobility, but in the context of a ruler's struggle for his legitimacy and authority in the state and in front of the neighbors. And of course, we do not have any so much really, but we have an evidence in the description of the legates who came into Vilnius after Gediminas' proposal or suggestion to be baptized, and so they describe that, or the legates described the process as they came to the Gediminas court and he refused to talk to them, and they heard that in the night he was crying because in fact he wanted to baptize so much, but due to the opposition that was in the state and the attempts to question his authority, he had to refuse. So this is probably the evidence, but it's not related to the title, in fact.
Dear Jonathan, your question was a reasonable one, because it is usual that Western scholars put up such questions because they want to know more about the perception on the Lithuanian part, how Lithuanians evaluated this or one thing. But I would like to just recall what many years ago Stephen Rowell has told us to know, that exactly in the 14th century one English county had much more sources available than all the Grand Duchy extending from the Baltic Sea to the North Sea, to the Black Sea. Such is the situation with source bases. In the case of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, it is grand in territory, but rather small in written record as we have at our disposal. Any more questions? One quick question, and if not, when we have deserved our refreshments, and now we have a coffee break and come back exactly at 4 o'clock. It means GMT +3 summertime. Thank you for your attention and have a good break.